Good morning, Build members. Dave Wilkes here. A pleasure to be with you again this morning. And I'd like to welcome you to our member-only briefing on Build's latest research report, entitled rather provocatively, Forecast for Failure, How a Broken Forecasting System is at the root of the GTAHA's housing shortage, and most importantly, how it can be fixed. The report examined how forecasting and the modeling that goes with that has contributed to housing supply and affordability challenge in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and outer ring communities. It also makes several practical recommendations on how to improve the foundation of that forecasting that informs planning, which is at the core of how we plan for housing and commercial spaces. I'm delighted to have with me the lead author of the report, Dr. Mike Moffat, who will highlight the key findings, but more importantly, what it means for our members and our business and the work that the association does as we advocate for policies that facilitate increased housing supply and affordability. Dr. Moffat is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute, a national research network and policy think tank that is based at the University of Ottawa. The Institute delivers world-class research and work with public and private partners, all to advance practical policies and market solutions for a stronger, cleaner economy. Mike is also an assistant professor in business, economics, and public policy group at the Ivey Business School at Western University. Mike, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. I enjoy our conversations, and I'm looking forward to you sharing this important research findings with our members. Over to you, sir.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everyone for attending at 8:30 in the morning on a short week. So let's get right to it. So here's basically what we're going to go through. So I'm going to give a sort of big picture outline that talks not just about this research, but a couple of other papers that we did, studies that we conducted at SPI. So we did Forecast for Failure. We did one with the Ontario home builders called Baby Needs New Home, and a third one that was released just last week called 1 Million New Ontarians. So the first thing that we need to understand is that Ontario's population in the 5 years before the pandemic grew by about 1 million people. And this is a lot. That in any given 5-year period, we tend to grow by about 600,000. So all of a sudden we grew by 1 million people. So that's an extra 400,000 people that we need to house. Despite all of this extra population growth, new home construction, however, didn't keep pace. We didn't increase the number of homes that were built in the GTA. There were some increases outside of the GTA in smaller communities like Lucan and Thorold and Woodstock and so on. But in the Toronto area, not much changed, despite the fact that we had this big population growth. So that sort of raises a question that we look at Forecast for Failure of why is that? Why did we not respond to this population growth? And I believe, and the sort of thesis of Forecast for Failure is that the growth plan was based on bad forecasts, that the growth plan that governs the GTA should have seen this increased population growth happening and responded to it, but it didn't. So because of this, we're seeing a lack of homes causing an exodus of young families out of the GTA. We're seeing particularly Toronto, York, and Peel. We're seeing people leave and move to the rest of the province, and it's primarily, but not exclusively, but it's primarily parents of young children. And all of this was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has accelerated these trends. And again, this is a problem because we've created a GTA that is essentially not friendly for families. That people are having to decide to either continue working in the GTA or and not have kids, or have kids and move to a Woodstock, a Stratford, a London, or so on. And finally, I would suggest that these trends are going to continue. The Ontario Ministry of Finance expects that population growth is going to continue. We will likely have some ups and downs as far as housing prices go. We may have a correction, but the long-term shortages of housing aren't going away unless we really change how we build housing in this province, and in particular in the GTA. So let's talk about the growing province. So here I've shown basically how many people does Ontario add in any 5-year period. If we go back to the 80s, we had a big baby boom. So our population grew quite a bit in the 1980s. After that, we would grow anywhere by about 600,000 to 800,000 people every 5 years. Now we're growing by over 1 million. And the reason why we're growing over by a million is that we're having an international student boom. That's that sort of green area called net non-permanent residents. Though I would suggest that that term is misleading. And it's the term non-permanent is misleading. That basically what we've done in Canada over the last decade is we've created a system that uses our colleges and universities as a pathway to permanent residency. So students come, they from overseas, they come to a college, a university, they graduate, they work 3 years after graduation, and then they gain permanent residency. So we're bringing over a lot of really talented 17, 18, and 19-year-olds who are planning to stay and are planning to raise a family 10 to 15 years from now. So we need to prepare for that. So new home building is not keeping pace with this population growth. So if we look at home building, and this is all unit types, so this is everything from high-rise apartments to single detached to you name it, that despite having record population growth, the number of housing units we added in this province only went up by about 10% and was significantly lower than it was 20 years ago and significantly lower than the baby boom in the 1980s. So housing construction did respond a little bit, but only by about 10% and mostly outside of the GTA. So if we think in terms of not number of people, but number of families or number of households, well, it should be that for every one new household, you have one new house. And historically speaking, that's largely been true. That blue shows the number of housing completions in a 5-year period, and the red bar shows how many new households were formed. And these things tend to keep track with each other. That sometimes we build more houses and we have new households, and vice versa. Sometimes we have more new households than new houses. But over the last 5 years, we've built about 350,000 unit types, and a lot of those are bachelor condos, despite the fact that we've had about 415,000 new families. So we were off by about 65,000 units, and the type of units that were being built were disproportionately small, smaller units relative to the 1980s and 1990s. So, and when we look at the city of Toronto itself, again, we've got this massive population increase, about 60% over average. I defy you to tell any difference between these two bars. I assure you that they are different. They are. I did not just put the same data twice. They are different. But basically, the city of Toronto did more of the same. It did not change the number or types of homes that were built between at the beginning of the decade versus the end of the decade, despite the fact that we had this population boom. So we basically, the city of Toronto responded by not really changing a thing. So why is that? Why were we caught sleeping? And this goes to the paper Forecast for Failure. So in Ontario, we have a growth plan for the GTA that goes back to 2005 and had a major update in 2017. And this update is important. And the growth plan is divided out into two parts. That one, we have the GTHA, so the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, as shown by yellow. And then we have what they call the outer ring, which is this area, this kind of orangey, pinky color. And this Ontario growth plan governs all the sort of municipal plans under it, that the municipal plans have to conform to the Ontario growth plan. And the idea behind the growth plan is to ensure that the amount of housing matches population growth and matches need, right? So you don't underbuild, but you don't overbuild either, right? That's kind of the point of this whole exercise. But that exercise, again, if you want to make sure you're not underbuilding or overbuilding, you have to be able to predict how many people are going to be moving to the GTAH. And the growth plan has consistently got it wrong, but consistently got it wrong in one direction, that it consistently underestimates the number of people or the population growth of the GTAH, particularly from international sources, so immigration and international students. So if we look at the period 2016 to 2021, the last 5 years, the original forecast for the growth plan said, we think the GTAH is going to bring in about 398,000 people from outside of Canada. When those numbers were updated by Hempson in 2012, they increased that. They said, actually, it's probably going to be closer to 480,000. Well, it turns out that the number was actually over 600,000. So Canada, the GTA brought in over 100,000 extra people from international sources than the growth plan predicted. So, and again, those 100,000 people all need to live somewhere, but we weren't expecting them to arrive. And the point of a forecast for failure is we should have expected them to rise. This is not something that happened by accident. This was planned. And when I say it was planned, the federal government under Harper, but continuing under Trudeau, made some very important changes to how immigration works in Canada. The first is that they allowed international students, when they came in, that basically they could work off campus without applying for a visa. And the second change in January 2015 is it allowed those international students after 3 years to apply for express entry and gain permanent residency. And this was on purpose. And I think these were actually really good changes. One of the issues we've always had in Canada is with our immigration system is foreign credential recognition. Right, that somebody gets a credential from overseas, and our employers don't really know what to do with it, don't know the value of it, and so on. So the Harper government it said, well, that didn't make any sense. So instead of bringing people over when they're 28 or 29 with credentials that we're not really sure what to do with, why don't we bring people over at 17, 18, 19, have them get their credentials in Canada and then immigrate? Because then our employers will know, what a degree from University of Toronto or a diploma from Sheridan is worth. So I think this is a really good change. But for whatever reason, the Ontario government under Wynne wasn't paying attention. I still don't entirely know what was going on, but they never referenced any of this. They never took any of this into account in the 2017 growth plan. And they were using population forecasts that predated these changes. So the federal government basically overhauled how immigration works in Canada, but the provincial government didn't take any of that into account when updating the growth plan. And I think it got us to where we are today. And second thing, the issue with the growth plan is the growth plan tends to also overestimate the number of housing units that we will have in the GTAH. So if we look at the year 2021, our original forecast from 2005 said, we'll have about 2.8 million, 2.86 million units. When those numbers were updated in 2012, it said, actually, it's going to be closer to 2.76 million. And then finally, the real number turned out to be closer to 2.73 million. So think about this for a second. Our population is growing faster than the growth plan forecasts, but our new home construction is actually growing slower than the growth plan predicts it would. That's a problem when you're adding more people but fewer homes. That's going to get you a housing shortage. So, that is the big sort of summary of the research, where We say, okay, despite the federal government making all these changes, none of it filters through the growth plan. And secondly, that the growth plan is really based on a bunch of best case scenarios. So there's no wiggle room in it. There's no, federal budgets, for instance, have contingencies built in. Say, okay, if our numbers are wrong, we're going to build in a cushion that will give us some breathing room. There's no breathing room in the growth plan. It's just like, here's the number, this is it. And if we're wrong, we're wrong. So finally, how this has manifested itself, and I'll go through these pretty quick, is there's a large exodus of young families leaving the city of Toronto. So this is just a number of people moving within Ontario. The blue line shows how many people on net are leaving the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. And that's, we're seeing more and more people leave. About 50,000 people leave the GTAH on net. And where they're going to partly is the outer ring, partly is places like the Niagara region and so on, Niagara region, Barrie, and so on. But where they're increasingly going to is southwestern Ontario. They're basically going down the 403, going down the 401. They're going to Woodstock, to Stratford, to London, to so on. They're going really far away from the GTA. So here's another conception of this. This is something I did for Maclean's magazine back in December. This isn't looking at migration. This is just looking at how many kids are there under the age of 5 that live in different parts of Ontario. The little purple area is the city of Toronto. And as you see, that the number of kids who live in the city of Toronto peaked in 2013 and has kind of cratered since then. We look at Peel and York, it's gone down as well, but it's starting to dip back up a little bit. But if you look at southwestern Ontario, and by southwestern Ontario, it's basically you can draw a line between Barrie and London. The number of kids under 5 there is absolutely booming. It's skyrocketing, and it's not skyrocketing because because Guelph is having a baby boom. It's skyrocketing because you've got all these U-Haul trucks leaving Toronto, Mississauga, and Brampton, and moving across southwestern Ontario. And I want to reiterate, all of this was happening before the pandemic. Everything I just told you has nothing to do with the pandemic whatsoever. It all predates the pandemic. The pandemic has accelerated this trend. So if you look at, this is the number of people who are moving. These are the number of kids under the age of 5 who are moving from one part of the province to the other. Look at that big change in Toronto, the city of Toronto, between 2019, the year before the pandemic, 2020, and then 2021. Last year, we saw on net, 10,000 kids under the age of 5 leave the city of Toronto. We saw an additional on net 2,000 kids leave York and Peel to other parts of the province. Sometimes they're staying in the GTA, sometimes they're going to Durham or Halton or so on, but a lot of the times they're going to the Woodstocks and Londons and Tillsonburgs of the province. I would suggest that this is a problem. So Ontario growth is expected to accelerate. Remember when I said that we grew by 1 million people? Well, the Ontario Ministry of Finance has population projections for the province, and they're basically saying expect more of the same. That they are saying for every 5-year period, Ontario is going to continue to grow by 1 million people or more. And I would point out that the Ontario Ministry of Finance made these projections before the recent announcement by the federal government to increase immigration targets. So these are already out of date, and they're out of date by being too low. So again, we're going to have so much population growth that we need to house people, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing this research, and we're so excited to see the provincial government with the task force and the federal government with the housing accelerator start to take these issues seriously. So if we look at what the Ministry of Finance is saying for the GTA, so this is minus Hamilton, they're saying that they're expecting the GTA's population growth to be higher than it has been in recent memory. So that's going to be a lot of housing that we need. So we did with the Ontario Home Builders Association, we looked at the GTA and basically said, how many new homes are we going to need to support that population growth that's being predicted? And what we found was that for every year, we're going to need about 40 to 50,000 additional homes. And you can see the numbers here for 5-year periods, and we break it down between low and medium density and high-rise apartments. This is what we're forecasting the demand from population growth to be based on the Ontario Ministry of Finance numbers, which again are a little bit out of date because they don't take into account the recent immigration changes. So the takeaways from this is that Ontario's population boom is projected to continue. Our work suggests that this is going to create a need for 1 million net new homes. The provincial task force has actually put the number at 1.5 million, and I actually think that's a prudent thing to do. That's probably closer to the truth. Young families are looking for new housing. That's who's moving across the province. That's where the biggest shortages are. They're housing for family. If we don't build those houses, we're going to lose talent. We're already seeing out migration of young families to places like Atlantic Canada and Alberta and the United States. That's probably going to continue. This is going to put a lot of pressure on municipalities to provide the infrastructure for the provincial government to provide the schools and so on that's necessary to support this growth. So are municipalities prepared? Are home builders prepared? Is our labor market prepared? My dad was a retired sheet metal worker, HVAC worker. There's a lot of guys in his cohort who are retiring or about to retire. Do we have the labor force necessary to build all these homes? So I think that's enough for me from now. I feel like I kind of fire hose a lot of information at you, but I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to the questions.
Dr. Moffat or Mike, thank you very much. Great presentation. We do have a number of questions from the participants and our members, which I will get to, but I just wanted to share with the members, we released the Forecast for Failure paper a 3 weeks ago at a virtual media conference. Because the research is so compelling, we want to make sure that it was used as an agent of change. It's no good, as Mike, no disrespect to your work. If it sits on a shelf, it's another aspect of failure. So we got great pickup with Mike. I think you were probably very busy doing a bunch of media interviews, TVO, Globe, Star, National Post, and there was no challenge. Everybody got it. And more importantly, we've taken this work, and OHBA has also taken the work that you previously did, and briefed municipalities and the provincial government around what you see as much as a housing threat, but a competitive threat as well to our economy. And I was pleased to see within the task force report, there's a recognition that the forecasting models need to be adjusted to reflect what you've indicated. And there needs to be, I think another suggestion that you had that you didn't necessarily highlight here is, and maybe I'll get you to speak about it, is, when we do budget forecasting, when the federal finance minister does budget forecasting, I recall from a previous life, he'd gather a whole bunch of smart economists in a room and talk about sensitivity analysis. Can you just share what that would be? And then as a follow-up to that, before I get to some of the member questions, what's the solution? And what, as you've talked to policymakers, are they listening? But talk to a little bit about the way economic trends are forecast.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a number of recommendations in Forecast for Failure, but I think that the first two are the most important. So the first is that we think that there should be forecasting happening every year. That if we look at the growth plan, that this has been done every sort of 8 years. What happens is you have these federal government changes, changes to international student rules, changes to immigration targets, or so on. And the lack sort of recognition around, that doesn't filter through municipal plans, through the growth plan. I've been I've talked to municipalities sort of outside of the growth plan, and I kind of, look at what their municipal plans are based on, and I've seen them use immigration forecasts that are 20 or 25 years old. And I'm just like, Jean Chrétien is not prime minister anymore. We need to update these things. So I think, having more updated forecasts, yearly updated forecasts for the entire province, so we can have a better idea of what's going on. That doesn't necessarily mean we change our plans every year, because I don't think that's particularly realistic, but it's an accountability exercise. We need to know how we're doing. I also agree that, having additional forecasters there, just like we do in the budget, federal budget, provincial budget, they get 15 different forecasters, and they say, this is what we see is happening. And they can conduct a sensitivity analysis around that. And they can see, okay, what if this guy's right versus, what if she's right? And so on. So that we see that as being particularly important. And then the second thing is, we should not be building towards the minimum, right? Because we basically, and that was our second recommendation, is just like in a federal budget or provincial budget, you have the numbers, and then you build in sort of a $3 billion cushion to say, okay, if interest rates change in a certain way, or the economy doesn't do as well as we think, and we don't collect as much GST, we want to build in that buffer to allow us to do that. We think we need to do the same thing on housing, where we could say, okay, we think the population is going to grow by 1 million people over the next 5 years, but we're actually going to set the target at 1.1 or 1.2, just in case we're wrong. And I think those two things, better, more diverse forecasting, but also building in contingency to the growth plan, and building in humility, sort of recognizing that there's no perfect forecast. We're never going to get this right. So let's be humble about what we know and say, okay, let's build in a range instead of trying to hit an exact number, which we know won't be correct.
And do you see governments listening as you present this? Is there a recognition that you're on to something? Are they saying, no, the numbers are lying, I don't believe you? What are you hearing? And because I know you've been very active in briefing both municipal leaders and the province.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to do my own home, and the federal government. Yeah, so we've talked to all three levels of this, and yeah, it's the reception has been fantastic. Occasionally, I think the worst thing we get is say, well, we think you're emphasizing this too much, and maybe you need to be looking at these other things, et cetera, et cetera. But for the most part, they are listening across the board, all three levels of governments, and they are sort of recognizing we have a problem, which I think is the first step towards change. And I have to tell you, we do a lot of work at SPI. That's not always the case. Sometimes we feel like we're, shouting into the void on issues. I think here they recognize and say, okay, you know what, this doesn't make any sense. Having these things updated at 8 years, and there's a recognition that, if you say you're going to grow by 400,000, you grow by 600,000. That's a problem, and we should be doing a postmortem analysis to try and figure out, okay, what exactly went wrong.
And Bill is certainly advocating with the research that you have with those various levels of government. And as I mentioned previously, and pardon the repetition, the task force report reflects that as well. So part of our job is to make sure that this research turns into reality. And I'm very hopeful that it will. And I think, as one of our speakers said on a previous webinar, our time is now to create the change, as we have elections coming up June 2nd in the province and October 24th municipally. And for the members on the line, this is going to be one of our key focuses to ensure that the way we model the future demand and supply changes so that we don't repeat history. Allow me to get to some questions from the members. Mike, one question referenced, divorce rates in particular, but does the data take into consideration changing trends on what is leading to more households? There could be changing family structure, international students, smaller families, one-child families. How does your report reflect that?
Yeah, so that came up a little bit more in the baby needs a new home report, but absolutely, we look at those trends and use that to take into account. So we're actually not seeing so much in the province increase divorce. I mean, you saw that more in the 80s and 90s. That's pretty much leveled off. But we do take into account things like birth rates, which tends to be a big one. And the interesting thing about this is there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem here, that it's not just we need to take into account birth rates to figure out how many houses we need, but also a shortage of housing actually reduces the birth rate. Right. That, you think about it, you're living in mom and dad's basement. You're not going to be having kids, or you're going to be having kids later. And there's been some interesting research out of the UK on this, basically showing that as house price, unless you're an existing homeowner, as house prices go up, that actually causes families to have fewer non-home-owning families to have fewer children and delay the birth of their first child. Because again, you're renting a one-bedroom apartment somewhere, you're living with mom and dad, you're probably not wanting to start a family right away. So you get into these sort of interesting discussions. It's like, yes, you have to take all of these factors into account when you're trying to figure out how many houses to build, but also recognizing how many houses you build also changes all of those other things.
So an interesting question that we received beforehand: how can the industry and private sector help in this? I think we've outlined what the association is doing from an advocacy point of view, and as part of that, is there information as you look at these trends that you wish you had that perhaps the industry can provide? So a two-part question there: how can the industry be part of the solution, and what more data do you
Yeah, absolutely. So, certainly better when we have, housing completion data. A lot of the data that would be particularly helpful is around the sort of why question. Why is it that houses are not getting built at a certain rate? Pressing municipalities to release data on approval times and things like that. I really think the data piece would help, partly because it would I'm selfish and would help researchers like me figure out what's going on. But I also think it would be a big accountability exercise. Right. Imagine if you had two municipalities, both in the same region, say York region or whatever, and one of those municipalities takes twice as long to approve as the other one. I would not want to be the mayor of that municipality, right? I think we can actually affect change. And it's funny coming from me because I'm a policy guy, but I think sometimes you don't even need policy. That if you have good data, it acts as an accountability measure, that the media starts asking questions of like, okay, well, why is it your neighbors can approve this in 3 months, but it's taking us 6? And no mayor or council is going to want to be the one getting those questions. So I think the more you guys can share that information, those stories. And I guess the other thing I would add is a lot of the digging we've done has started with conversations we've had with builders and also with real estate agents as well. So, those stories are important of, telling us, okay, Mike, I was doing this thing and this happened. It gives us an idea of where to dig. So I think sharing that data, sharing that information, telling your story can really help affect change.
Thank you. And Mike, the one about approval timelines, couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
We did a study from Bill's perspective back, I'm trying to remember now, 2019, that did exactly what you did, you suggested, and we did a scorecard based on municipalities. We had some interesting reaction. And you're right, those that didn't want to be in that bottom quartile challenged the results, and those that were in the top crowed about the results. So it had exactly that. Overall, no one was meeting the timelines as legislated by the province. And once again, that's another area of focus that we have from Build as we advocate over the next 12 months, is making sure that those timelines are adhered to, and there's consequence if they're not. And we're redoing that study in September of this year. and we plan to release it in advance of the municipal election for exactly the reason you've suggested. So thank you for that. It's almost as if we planned it.
Great minds. Yeah, I have to. Dave did not set me up for that. I did not know that was coming, but I see that as important. And I always try and put myself in the shoes of a politician or a policymaker on that. And a lot of times we kind of think of what incentives can we create for municipalities, and can we create this $5 million fund or $10 million fund? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, that might be helpful, but having again, if I'm a counselor, having a good story about me in the media or having a bad story in the media is probably going to affect change a lot more than some pot of money that's going to just disappear into a municipal budget.
Reputation is priceless. And
exactly.
I've been a real-time fact checked by one of my colleagues on staff. The report was not done in 2019, it was done in 2020, but the impact was indeed as described. A couple of questions I'd like to get to from the chat. And I think we've talked about this a little bit, but we'll reemphasize it. What solutions are you suggesting to the province and municipalities to adapt their current policies to take into account rapid population growth? To repeat, you've talked about sensitivity analysis, bridging to policy changes made elsewhere, immigration, working with colleges, as you say in the report, to understand international trends. From a build perspective, we've obviously been doing the work around increasing efficiencies of approval, designating land for growth. Is there anything else that you've been advising?
So I would say all those things, and the biggest one again being make sure your municipal plans are based in reality. I think the real time data is incredibly important. So yeah, I think all of those things that you listed, working with the colleges and universities, I've never really understood how we can make municipal plans, recognizing that a lot of growth are coming from the colleges and university. And I say this as somebody who's worked at a number of universities. We have a really good idea of how many international students we're going to bring in every year for the next 5 years. Every college and university has a growth plan. Those growth plans should filter through into the municipal plan. And that's a big theme of forecasted failure, is that the federal government makes plans, the province makes plans, the municipalities make plans, and the colleges and universities make plans, but they don't talk to these plans don't interact with each other. They don't talk to each other. So everything's kind of siloed off. So that is what we're sort of advising municipalities. And it seems to be well received. We've talked to a number of counties, both within the GTA and outside of the GTA, and I think there is sort of recognition there that this cannot go on.
Right, and one of the things you indicate in the report, or the recommendation that we've certainly been advocating, is open source data, for lack of a better term. That don't hide this information. Understand how the forecasting is being built. Provide it to both the private sector and the government that. This is not a competitive exercise, it's a collaborative one, and we all need to work together. Can you talk a little bit about that idea? I call it open source.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll give you an example. It's another project we're doing. We're releasing this March 8th. We're working with the London Development Institute in London, Ontario, and we're trying to figure out, a lot of these sort of questions of, what's happening in the Middlesex Elgin area and so on. And what we're seeing in Elgin, Middlesex is the population is absolutely booming. Like the London metro area is the fastest growing city outside of British Columbia, fourth fastest in Canada. And what's happening is that a disproportionate amount of this housing construction is actually happening outside of the municipal boundaries of London. That basically London has, like most cities, an urban growth boundary. And what's happening is they're basically leapfrogging over that boundary, and they're building houses in Lucan and in Komoka and so on. Getting data on this has been incredibly hard. Now, luckily, our friends at the CMHC have been really good. We've got some contacts in there, and they've been able to help me, get things on completions and so on. but we shouldn't have to ask. This is our data. This is your. So the fact that we silo this off, and it makes it hard for us to kind of understand what's going on as an outsider. And I think that's a problem. Again, as the City of London does its municipal plan, we should have an idea of how many houses are getting built within the city versus how many houses are getting built that are getting leapfrogged over the urban boundary. And the fact that information is not readily accessible, I think is a problem when we're doing municipal planning.
Agreed. Let me just ask a couple last, and I'm saving a really good one for the last, so you might need to drink a coffee before that. One of the comments in the trade, you'd referenced your dad in the sheet metal business, and I won't ask you the question, but I'll recognize the problem. There's a variety of things that we need to do to solve the housing crisis. One of them is to attract skilled trades to the sector. I think there's many examples like yourself where your dad was someone that built the city, to use a phrase from a song, and you're now using your mind to attract. But I mean, there's not a lot of conversations around the dinner table about becoming, a skilled tradesperson. We certainly within the association recognize that, and it's a great place to make a living. And I think you're going to see a lot more focus on that. And additionally, Mike, I would argue our immigration policy needs to reflect the need for skilled trades. So a couple of areas. I won't put you on the hook on that one, but
I totally agree. And I think to the province's credit, they recognize this, and Minister McNaughton is making a number of changes on that. But I think that needs to happen, and I think the immigration piece is a large piece of that, trying to figure out how, again, we're bringing over a lot of talent to our colleges and universities. How can we increase pathways to get them into the trades and so on, because it is a great life. And then on the other side, this is the sort of classic problem. And I say that my dad was a sheet metal worker, ended up becoming a high school shop teacher in Strathroy, and ended up teaching these things. And I got, saw the question here, why didn't you become this? Well, part of it is I never had shop class in the ones I go to. And, being a sort of rebellious teenager, I didn't really want to learn from my dad. He tried to teach me welding, and I'm maybe the world's worst welder. But yeah, I think exposing kids to more of the trades, I think, would be incredibly helpful. Again, we didn't have a shop in my high school, and I think that's a problem. You get a lot of kids who would be interested in learning about this, but they lack those opportunities.
I will mention to the members, we will make the slides available. The research report that we've talked about is on our website under our report section. So if you haven't taken a read of it, I encourage you to do so. Mike, a question that has many answers, and it's not in your area of core research, but I'm interested in your opinion, because obviously I think everybody on this call will have one. How do we strip politics from planning, and how do we resist the resistance to growth, to the need for growth that your numbers so compelling speak about?
Well, I think we're starting to get there. And I think I'm a fan of many of the recommendations that the task force makes about being able to build things by right. It's always struck me as odd. So I'm currently in Ottawa, the city of Ottawa. And I could tear down my house tomorrow and build a McMansion, and nobody could really stop me in the neighborhood. But if I wanted to put in a duplex, then basically all of my neighbors sort of get a veto, and it gets very sort of political. So, I think we need to sort of expand what we can do sort of by right. Doesn't mean that, anybody can do anything, but, expanding that window. And, the province has suggested that on sort of number of stories, building up to, I think, 4 plexes on property and things like that. I think we'll go there. And I think the appetite has changed for that I think these issues had always been seen as a bit zero sum of the fact that, homeowners wanted to protect their value and non-homeowners, wanted to get into the market. But I'm finding now over the last couple of years, even homeowners are getting upset about this. So I have a number of friends who ran for office federally in the last election. And they said, Mike, the one thing that really surprised us was we were hearing at doors concerns about what's going on in housing from homeowners. I'm like, okay, well, that's strange. You would think they were doing really well. And they're like, well, yeah, but most of them, either a lot of them have kids in their 20s and are either upset that they're having to give their kids huge piles of money for down payment, or they have, they have a son living on a couch and living in the basement, and they'd like to sort of move them out. So I think some of the politics is starting to get out of it. I think this is seen as a little bit less zero sum than it has in the past, and even homeowners in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is affecting them, not because it's necessarily affecting them personally, but it's affecting their kids.
Great. Last question in the chat before we just give one more opportunity for people to post. It's a rather specific one around areas of settlement, and that not only limits development lands, but also drives it. I think that's a symptom of a bigger problem. We have to plan for growth. We have to designate areas for growth. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and I think, I don't want to talk about any sort of one particular issue because, this is different from region to region to region. But I also share the concern that people have around, around sprawl and around protecting green areas and so on. I absolutely share that. We're losing 175 acres of farmland every day to development, and that is an issue. But I would suggest that in many instances, how we're defining urban boundaries is actually making the problem worse because of this leapfrogging effect that I talked about in the London area, where it's like, okay, we set this really tight urban boundary, and then everybody just moves 10 minutes north of that and then drives back into the city. That doesn't do anyone any good. I mean, it makes sprawl worse, but also from the perspective of the city of London, now you've got all of these people living outside of the city, not paying municipal taxes, but coming into the city to shop and work and so on. So I do think we need to look clearly at these issues. And when we're doing municipal planning, really understand how quickly the population is growing so that you don't see as much of that leapfrogging effect and going, okay, we're not, are we actually stopping sprawl, or are we making it worse by just pushing people out even further outside of them, outside of the boundaries of the city?
And the London problem that you described, Mike, is one that is not unique to London. We see it in the GTHA, where people are literally, you can see the band on the maps. And what I'm also, another one of the recommendations that is going forward is that as you build, wherever you build, make sure you build one near transit areas, whether they're highways or other types of infrastructure, but do so to increase density because the population demands it. And one of the findings that we've seen is that the GTAH has a very low density compared to other leading global areas. So it is a solution that's time has come. And if I just give you a perspective, we have seen the debate change. It is now that supply is a solution to affordability, and there is a laser focus on it. And I'm really hopeful over the course of the next 10 months, we're going to see change that affects the members' business and speed up approvals, tax appropriately, designate growth, model better. And the time really is now to make sure that our voice is heard loud and clear on that. If I may, we're just, before I wrap up with a final question, we're doing a number of other studies in addition to Mike's that we'll be releasing over the course of the next several months. Economic impact of the industry, how many jobs we create and the types of jobs, housing and the environment. Another area that I think is really important for us to focus on. And not only the way we build, but the remediation work that the industry undertakes to enhance the environment. Housing in the middle class and social equity. Mike, your description about families and young families, this is a key issue. And this is going to be where we have, I hate to use the word tension, but focus on this issue because it's becoming a real one. I mean, we both were describing issues where communities of London and farther afield in Edmonton, where housing prices are just going crazy. This is just a real issue. And then the softball that you lobbed me in September, we're doing the benchmarking 2.0. So for members, please watch for that over the course of the next little while. And I also will mention April 1st, another date. We have our next webinar with Terrian and HCRA and talking about some of the changes that are being put in place there. And we will have in-person events coming up in this the second quarter of this year as we move to be able to do this. So last question, Mike, crystal ball. Give us your ultimate solution. What is the next time we're having an election? Who are we congratulating? Not who are we congratulating. I will put you on the spot for that. What are we congratulating the government of the day for having done that reflects your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So take it back to the task force. I like the fact that there are 55 recommendations. I know that seems like a lot, but there's no silver bullet here. It took us, this problem was decades in the making, and it's going to take a lot of solutions to get it right. So I certainly think, streamlining approval processes, better accountability, more building along transit lines, I think is absolutely, vital. So all of these little things, and I'm hopeful in the provincial election that we are going to see sort of a race to the top when it comes to policy. So I've seen, and I think that was one of the big telling things out of the task force, that you saw almost no opposition to the recommendations from the Liberals and only a little bit from the NDP. And it was mostly, they didn't disagree with anything that was in it. It was more that they didn't really look at affordable housing issues. So I think that's a really good sign. And I'm hopeful that this issue almost becomes depoliticized, where basically the Liberals, the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Greens are all basically saying the same thing. That's my best case scenario, that whoever happens to win this spring and summer, they're all saying basically the same thing and going to make the similar changes.
That would be, I share your vision. And we've mentioned the task force a number of times. I was certainly very proud to serve on that task force as one of the panel members. And I do agree that it's, as it said in the intro, there are 55 recommendations, but they're not meant to be picked and choosed, as it says there. It is really a suite of things that we can address what is a generational problem. And I think the overwhelming message is, we have a system that's built for the 60s and 70s, and the type of demand and the type of families and the type of land available. We can't tinker. We need to revolutionize what we're doing. And indeed, that will be the focus of our conversation. Last comment I see in the chat. Can we retrofit existing stock? Absolutely. You've already mentioned that. Don't build a McMansion, but use that lot to build a fourplex. And once again, that type of change is something that is also anticipated in the report. So
and if I could add to that, so we look at this. We had a report called 1 Million New Ontarians that we released last week, and it was about this issue of family, getting more homes for families. And one of the ways can absolutely be retrofits, along with building new housing. The other thing that we're recommending is, if we want more families in Toronto, there's two other ways to get more houses. One is building more student housing, which would free up some of the existing stock, which is getting turned into student rentals. And the third is building more seniors-friendly housing, because there are a lot of people, like my parents, mid-70s, live in a 4-bedroom house and are just there because they're like, well, we don't really see anywhere to go. So I think there's a lot of solutions to creating housing for families. Part of it is just building those houses, but also part of it is building other things to unlock some of those existing homes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Mike. It is always a pleasure to chat with you. I enjoy your insights and your perspective and commentary. I remind members the information is available on our website that we presented today. I wish everybody a great whatever day it is, Wednesday, and as we head towards spring, and we'll look forward to seeing people at our April 1st webinar, which is our next step. Mike, always a pleasure. Thank you, members, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.